Welcome to Midlife Unraveled, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the twists and turns of midlife. I'm your host, Anita Gilbert, and I've transitioned from the corporate world of investment banking to become the proud owner of a yoga and Pilates studio. Together, we're going to navigate the exhilarating roller coaster that is midlife. Each episode, we dive deep with a seasoned expert to rediscover and redefine how to live our best during this life-changing period. Join us every Tuesday for new episodes, brimming with wisdom, insights, inspiration, and a laugh along the way. So strap in, because Midlife Unraveled is about to redefine the way you embrace midlife. Subscribe today and take this journey with us. Delighted to welcome Martin Blake to Midlife Unraveled. Martin has spent over 30 years in professional services advisory and was chairman of KPMG from 2012 to 2019. In addition, he established KPMG's global fintech insurance community and was KPMG's lead partner for New South Wales Government from 2017 to 2021. Martin has a strong commitment to supporting better community outcomes, and he serves on a number of not-for-profit boards. A very personal tragedy inspired Martin to start Groundswell Foundation, which brings together some of Australia's most influential and experienced leaders to address issues associated with mental health and loneliness. Loneliness is a huge issue, not just in Australia, but globally. And I think you'll be very surprised by some of the points that Martin raises. I know I certainly was. I hope you enjoy this episode. Martin Blake, welcome to Midlife Unraveled.
Great, delighted to be here, Anita.
So today we're talking about loneliness. Let's start with a definition. How do we actually define loneliness?
Every human being in the world has a perception of the relationships that you'd like to have. And loneliness is the gap between that perception and reality. And it's for that reason why young people are most profoundly affected by loneliness. Estimated that 50% of young people in Australia are lonely because they're connected but disconnected and spend a disproportionate amount of time on social media, and they're seeing often enhanced photographs of friends or cohorts doing things when Taylor Swift comes into town, and they're living in their house in Blacktown, sharing a bedroom with their sister, and looking at what's going on social media is very different from their lives. Yeah. And that's why it profoundly affects young people, and they're the cohort most impacted by loneliness.
So personally, you've had huge corporate roles. You were the chairman of KPMG New South Wales from 2012 to 2019. Why this interest in loneliness?
Well, when we went into COVID, my mother unfortunately contracted COVID in the UK, and because of the travel restrictions, I wasn't able to go and visit to her. And so at the beginning of 2021, really at the height of the COVID restrictions, unfortunately she passed away in an NHS hospital. We said goodbye to her on FaceTime. And she died the loneliest person I know in the world, with no friends in the world, no family in the world, and no support.
So that is a good place for you to do all the valuable work that you do. So how does loneliness actually impact our mental health? What is happening? What's the connection between suffering mental health issues and loneliness?
Well, loneliness is not per se a mental health issue. Loneliness is quite distinctive from mental health and social isolation. So you can be in a room of a lot of people and feel very disconnected and lonely, or you can be on a property with all your animals around you and feel very connected with your community and friends. So loneliness really, the instance of loneliness, people that are lonely are much more susceptible to mental health issues And people with mental health issues are much more susceptible to feeling lonely as well. Now, being lonely is the equivalent to drinking 6 alcoholic drinks a day or having 15 cigarettes a day. It has a profound impact on your health. In fact, the US Surgeon General produced a report last April called the Loneliness Epidemic. And he cited that in the US, loneliness was a more profound health and social issue affecting Americans than obesity, smoking, and substance abuse.
Wow.
So that's the gravitas of the situation. And
is it linked with depression?
Yeah, and also suicidal ideation as well.
So is there that overlap with depression? People who are lonely, are they more likely to be depressed? Can one lead to the other? If you are depressed, are you more likely to be lonely?
Absolutely. And there are particular cohorts of individuals, particularly minority cohorts, that are more susceptible to being lonely. In fact, there's a 50% higher rate of loneliness in those communities. So these are such minorities as First Nations people, LGBTI, migrants. They all fall in this category, and they're at greatest risk of not only being lonely, but a higher instance of mental health.
Right, okay. So can loneliness occur in clusters?
Yeah, it can appear in clusters. I mean, the biggest cluster in Australia and globally is young people. And, very sadly, more than 50% of young people aged between 16 and 24 suffer from loneliness. Now, that's a profound issue because it's our children, our children's children, that hold the future of the world in their hands. And it's almost inconceivable in this world of social media and digital connectedness that loneliness become a health crisis affecting 1 in 3 Australians and half of young people in Australia.
Yeah.
And the other slightly bizarre thing, it's a health priority that has almost entirely been overlooked by health regulators and providers in Australia.
Right. Because it seems ironic that you've got never at a period in history have we been so connected. Have we had so many forms of connection online? It seems contradictory that we should then find ourselves in such high states of loneliness when we have so many methods to connect.
No, it is bizarre, but it turns out that an emoji is not a friendship. And in fact, young people are quite uncomfortable with communicating with humans or ringing up people and speaking to them on the phone when they could text them or message them over some social media platform.
I think that's definitely true. I've seen that with my own kids.
Yeah.
And
I have boy-girl twins who are in their late teens.
Yeah.
And, it's a profound problem because they can be sitting in the same room as a group of their friends and they're communicating each other through social media.
Yeah.
It's absolutely bananas.
Yeah. But is it that higher level of communication that prevents loneliness? I thought to actually prevent loneliness, we need to find those deeper connections with people. Is it just being on the phone with people and actually having more face-to-face contact superficially? Will that help rates of loneliness?
Not necessarily. It's connections that matter. And that is, in fact, the report that we've published that's available on our website, groundswellfoundation.com.au, called Connections Matter, which is the most comprehensive report ever produced on loneliness in Australia. To give some context to that, the UK is the most advanced jurisdiction in the world on loneliness. They've had a minister for loneliness for over a decade and a department tackling loneliness. And I had the good fortune of coaching the UK Prime Minister's head of media and spokesman for mental health for the last 4 years, who's a brilliant Rhodes Scholar from Queensland, who worked with Boris Johnson, number 10 Downing Street. Because of that, I had access to Whitehall and all the research done over the last 10 years, which I packaged up in a report and gave to Australia as a gift 2 years ago to start to build a groundswell and raise awareness on loneliness.
Yeah. So how do we, as parents, on a very kind of grassroots level, how do we help our kids be less lonely?
Well, there are a couple of things to do. One is to talk to not just your kids, but talk to your co-workers about your lived experience with loneliness. There is no one in Australia that has not been touched by loneliness in the last 5 years. May not be you, but it will certainly be within your family, and it will be in your cohort of co-workers or people that you interact with in the workplace. It could be in the schoolyard, it could be in the university campus, or it could be in the office or shop or wherever you are working. And there is a connection with cost of living pressures as well in terms of loneliness, because people don't want to go out. In Sydney, there are 1.7 million people that live alone, which is more people than in any other geography in Australia. So parents specifically can talk about their lived experience with loneliness, and they can also think about how they're creating an ecosystem or environment for their children to engage with other young people face to face and build meaningful connections. The third thing they can do is ensure that time is liberated for their children so that they can actually work on community-based activities. Because when you work on community-based activities, you have conversations with people which are much more authentic and real and much more purposeful. And that approach really is a great antidote to loneliness, because you're building meaningful connections. The other thing, if you're brave enough, is to talk with your children's friends' parents and their children's friends about loneliness and about their lived experience and what strategies they've put in place to tackle loneliness.
Right. How does a teenager go to identify lonely if they are lonely?
They have no friends.
Okay. But can they have friends and still be lonely? Because they
Absolutely.
don't have those deeper connections?
Absolutely. I'm in a friendship with someone over the other side of the world playing, who's a gamer. That's not necessarily a connection that matters or is a meaningful friendship that can positively impact a young person's mental health.
Yeah.
So
you have online...
it's face-to-face contact and contact with humans. I mean, there's been a lot of work done where young people going into residential aged care centres and talking with and supporting old people who are wise.
Yeah.
And that gives purpose to the young people, but it also gives real purpose to the aged Australians. And it's a real problem. One of the executives I coach is CEO for the largest retirement aged care centres in Australia, United. And she said to me 2 weeks ago, with a tear in her eye, I hate to tell you this, Martin, because I know you're very passionate about loneliness, but 65% of the residents in our aged care facility never receive a visitor. I mean, that's really quite shocking.
Yeah, that is. And I think a lot of us realise that loneliness is a real problem in the elderly. They may be living alone. They don't have a lot of contact. Getting out of the house is getting harder and harder. And we understand that, and something needs to be done. But I think the surprising part here is how lonely young people can be, and people who are surrounded by other people but don't have those meaningful connections to actually identify that they're actually not lonely. That's I think what I find most surprising. A question for you: can you have a meaningful connection with somebody and not be face to face?
Yes, of course you can. Because as I gave the example earlier, you can be living in your property in a remote area of Australia, physically disconnected with humans, but very closely connected with the ecosystem around you and the animals in that ecosystem. Dogs, cats, animals are a huge antidote to loneliness.
Okay.
Because they're loyal and show affection, expecting nothing in return. But they might be able to connect with their broader family, their friends, their network, using social media, using Zoom, Teams, and different ways of communication. Yeah. And certainly that's fundamentally changed since the pandemic.
Is there a different type of loneliness for people who live in urban environments versus people who live in rural environments?
Yes, there is. And that is a very interesting point because obviously when you live in a city like Sydney, where you're surrounded by people and it's busy, at least in the city from Monday to Thursday, because most people don't go into the city on Fridays now. They do working from home, which is a bit of a ruse in itself. But in remote areas, in regional areas, you've got the tyranny of distance. And because the state has reduced some of the public transport connections between these areas, it's very problematic, particularly for young people and old people, in terms of meeting up with people, because the distances are large and the transport connectivity is not great.
Do you think people in rural environments, though, make an extra effort because they're more aware of this as an issue?
I think one of the wonderful things about rural communities and regional communities is they tend to focus around key places. So let me give you an example. So there are 364 libraries in New South Wales. The government have doubled the funding for libraries in New South Wales, and the Treasury Secretary 5 years ago provided the funding for every library in New South Wales to be able to provide free access to Wi-Fi. So as a result of this, libraries in local communities which have the highest level of trust of any institution in a community provide a place and the convening power for different groups of people to get together to make meaningful connections. But certainly it provides an opportunity for disadvantaged groups, for migrants, for marginal groups to come together and make those connections.
It's lovely. That's actually really, really nice that these sort of things will have a huge impact. What about COVID? We were all very, 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 very aware of loneliness during COVID. Now that we're post-COVID, have loneliness rates returned to what they were pre-COVID, or is it worse, or what's the ongoing effect?
Yeah, there's not great data, evidence-based data on that in terms of assessing loneliness pre and post COVID, but certainly there's enough evidence to show that there has been an explosion in terms of mental health issues and loneliness in Australia, because people are connected but disconnected. And I guess the pandemic, because of the lockdowns, and we had some challenges in New South Wales with lockdowns, but in Victoria they had 265 days of lockdowns, which was for political reasons, not health reasons. And the impacts on mental health are yet to be fully understood in those communities.
Right.
Now, during the pandemic, you've got different cohorts of people that had very different experiences. So for people living on big properties or able to walk on the beach and get out, even though they're restricted with number of people they're able to meet and the distances they're able to travel, they had a very different experience to migrants that were based in inner city Melbourne. So you've got many instances of migrants living in a 2-bedroom apartment with 8 people, and they weren't able to leave the building. And the impact on mental health, loneliness, was really quite profound.
Yeah. Are introverts more likely to be lonely?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Because introverts are comfortable with their own company. Often it obviously varies between individuals, and they may have a very small cohort of trusted friends, colleagues. They don't need lots of friends, but it's the connections that matter. Well, they may be very close to their family. It really is a thing that's very individual and does depend on individuals.
Yeah. What about the differences between men and women? It's sort of traditionally been said that women are very much better at connecting with friends, going out and finding those connections and sharing things on a deeper level with their friends than men generally are. That is the kind of stereotype. But does that mean that men are more likely to be lonely?
Well, certainly men, they don't tend to make the same social connections that women do. So if you imagine my wife, who's a very lovely lady, who's from Yorkshire, and she's constantly talking to her friends. It's like a puppy sniffing around and finding out what's going on. Meanwhile, me, as a male, I don't need to talk to my friends all the time. Many of my friends are in London, which is where I'm from. But what I do is go to the corner of the garden, dig a hole, put a bone in the hole, cover it up, and I'm just happy that I know that when I want to dig up that bone or make contact with those friends, I can.
Yeah.
So there is a fundamentally different wiring, but men are particularly poor at expressing their emotions, and they tend to identify with their work and have very few connections outside of work and their immediate family. And this really comes to a head when there's a breakdown in relationships.
Yeah.
The inconvenient truth is that 50% of marriages fail in Australia. So that really is a profound problem.
So can you be in a marriage and be lonely?
Absolutely.
Do you think that's a big reason for, or not a big reason, but one of the reasons for marriages failing is that one or two of the parties are actually very, very lonely?
I mean, I couldn't, pretend to be an expert in terms of marriage and why they fail. I've certainly been fortunate enough to be married for 26 years, and but there are speed bumps all the way along the way, and I think it's a large part of the success of marriages is not when it's going well, but how do you deal with adversity?
The bumps.
And how do you come together to deal with adversity? There's an interesting piece of research with Chicago University that did where they put a married couple in a room and they could tell within 10 minutes whether their marriage was going to survive. And the way they did that
Do tell.
was just to ask them to think about a situation that they'd encountered in the last 12 months that caused tension in the family or between themselves, and get them to talk about it. Now, the language they used, the words they used to talk about that, there was a linear connection between that and whether their marriage would be successful.
Wow. That's fascinating. There's another episode there, isn't there?
Sure
Now,
is.
I want to talk about the stigma of loneliness. I feel generally it still does carry a lot of stigma. People don't want to admit to being lonely. How do we get through that to actually make a difference?
Mhm. Well, there are a couple of things. One, awareness. When I started the Groundswell Foundation, just about 4 years ago, there was nothing in the media about loneliness. No one was talking about loneliness. There was very little awareness of loneliness. So raising awareness through the community around loneliness is very important to ensure that people are not only aware, but they're able to have some practical strategies to actually address loneliness. But what you highlight is absolutely correct. There is a huge stigma associated with loneliness. There's been wonderful work done on mental health. So, when I was a senior role in professional services, if one of my team, rang up on a Monday and said, Martin, I've got a lot going on at home, I'm feeling really blue, I'd say, well, gosh, Bill or Sarah, take your time. We've got an employee support desk. Please reach out to them and get some support. Take a couple of days off. We're there behind you.
Yeah.
Now, if that same individual rang up on a Monday morning and said, look, I'm really having a tough time, Martin. I'm feeling lonely. I'm not going to come in for the next 3 days. You get a very different reaction.
Yeah. Yeah.
So dealing with the stigma associated with loneliness and through having evidence-based research and strategies to raise people's awareness around loneliness is very important.
I feel like loneliness now is where depression was maybe, 10, 15 years ago. It was the sort of thing that people didn't want to admit to. I feel now that people are a lot happier to say, yes, I do get depressed and I do suffer with depression. And it's hopefully they find that there is a non-judgmental response. And hopefully we are moving towards that kind of response with loneliness as well. But it is a long, long road. I sense also for people admitting that they are lonely, they suffer with loneliness, it's almost because of the stigma around it. I feel like people almost are stepping away. So what they need is to enhance those connections. But what ends up resulting is that people actually step away, almost like, oh, they have, they're lonely. I don't want to connect. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it just becomes, exaggerated, those behaviours. If you feel depressed and you feel lonely, the last thing you want to do is actually go meet other people. From the UK experience, there's the most effective way to tackle loneliness is to leverage the convening power of existing community assets in rural and urban areas to bring different cohorts of people together to make meaningful connections, be they young and old, be they migrants, be they First Nations people, be they LGBTI. But Australia is blessed with many assets in local communities, so libraries, tennis courts, swimming pools, retired servicemen league clubs. These are all institutions that provide a convening power for people to come together to build those meaningful connections.
Exactly.
So leveraging those is very important. And there's some simple strategies that we could do. So, for example, in Holland, what they've done is the major supermarket chains have implemented slow queues, because many old people, the only time they leave their house during the week is to go and get their groceries. And if they have an automated payment system and FPOS, then they don't speak to anyone. But if they have a slow queue and some bubbly, chatty shop assistant that's checking out what they're doing, and then they're able to talk to the people in their queue, then that builds meaningful connection. And so there are some very practical things that frankly don't cost very much, which we could do, which could have a profoundly positive impact on loneliness.
Yeah. I feel like all the convenience that we have has actually had a negative impact. So, like you mentioned, going to the supermarket checkout for elderly people, these trips out are hugely important because they do connect. There is a reason for getting out of the house, frankly, and those trips to the bank, those trips to buy the groceries, to pay bills, all that sort of thing. I see it with my own mother that everything's convenient. The shopping can be delivered, the banking's done online. There's no reason to leave the house anymore. And that's actually quite sad, because those day-to-day tasks that, if we're out and about and busy, we want to find a simpler way to do it. But for people who have a lot of time on their hands, these are a reason for getting out and connecting with people. And that, I think, is so, so important to really maintain, those trips to the bank, those trips to the post office, going and picking up the groceries. It's those small interactions, like you said, with the person at the supermarket queue. I really believe that those small interactions can have such a huge impact on how your outlook for the rest of the day, how you feel internally. They can be so uplifting for you. And our convenient society, unfortunately, has taken a lot of those opportunities away.
No, you're absolutely correct. And I think another thing that's very important is purpose. Because if we wake up in the morning and we've got no purpose, then you don't have the internal drive to make those connections. And that's why giving back in terms of community initiatives and whatever that might mean for you is very important for young, old people of all ages and all different types, because we're only here for a short time, and the things that we think are profoundly important to us now, when we're gone, we'll only be remembered for things we've given away.
Yeah, it's actually very well said. So how do you, if you are suffering with loneliness, is it something that you can fully recover from? Is it something that is likely to plague you for years to come? Can we move away from it permanently?
Well, that's an interesting question, because loneliness, the research on loneliness shows that it's actually quite difficult to bounce back from loneliness. And it does tend to spiral in quite a short period of time. I think with well thought out public policy with interventions that encourage individuals and enable them to connect in meaningful ways in communities is very important. Mm-hmm. So, for example, one of the professors on our reference group is Dr. Astor Burton, who is the global leader in the connection between loneliness and green space. And he promotes, he's a professor at Sydney University, and he promotes the idea of GPs prescribing nature so that people actually spend time in nature. If where you're living, if within 10 minutes there's a green area or park, there's a 30% lower instance of loneliness and mental health issues. So as the federal government and the state governments are struggling with affordable housing, that could have unintended consequence, because as we build medium density residential housing around transport hubs, which is what the New South Wales government is focused on doing, unless we do that in a way that ensures there are areas in those communities where people can connect. There's green space, there's trees, there's parks, there's benches, there's facilities to enable community activities, then we could in fact kick an own goal and institutionalise loneliness.
Yeah, that's very true. It's interesting that the remedy, one of the remedies is the green spaces, because this is what we talk about a lot for mental health, is to get out into nature, to walk, walk in a park, take a bushwalk, something like that. It's interesting that there is an awful lot of overlap with treatments for general mental health issues and for loneliness.
Absolutely.
So how does
loneliness... Sorry. Loneliness really represents a profound threat to our health and well-being. But we do have the power to respond. And every individual is able to take small steps in their own lives to strengthen their own relationships, support community efforts to build social connections. And, we can rise to meet this moment and challenge collectively together. And, we can build lives and communities that are healthier and happier.
Yeah.
And, we can ensure that Australia and the world is better poised than ever to take on some of these challenges that lay ahead.
Yeah.
And certainly, our future depends on what we do today, and we've all got an opportunity to contribute to this.
Yeah. So how does Australia compare globally with rates of loneliness?
It's quite similar in terms of the UK has a similar number of people that are lonely in terms of their population. Certainly in young people, around 50% of people in the UK are lonely. There's not, in Japan, there's a disproportionate number of people who are elderly that are lonely. In Japan, they have a minister for loneliness, but they haven't focused on young people. They're focused exclusively on old people because of the ageing demographics in the population. It's really an area where there's not great statistics to compare countries on loneliness, but it's certainly a groundswell of activity, and there's lots of things that are being done to start to tackle loneliness, particularly in Northern Europe, and there's a groundswell of activity certainly in North America, led by the US Surgeon General.
So what else are they doing in Northern Europe that we can learn from?
Well, they one of the things that the UK government have done is run awareness campaigns on loneliness, and they started off running general campaigns, which did raise awareness but weren't that effective. But they've really turned their attention to developing bespoke campaigns targeted on particular groups. They have tended to focus a lot on young people, and the reason for that is because young people hold the future of the world in their hands and are disproportionately impacted by loneliness. The public health and local community initiatives for elderly people are reasonably well mature and they're reasonably well catered for. But for young people, there's really no support whatsoever around loneliness. They've also, in Canada, GPs are able to prescribe nature when people go and see them, the doctors. That's not something that we're able to do in Australia.
Is that taken seriously?
Absolutely.
That's good.
Very seriously. Very seriously.
I feel like people go to see their GP and they all automatically expect to walk out with a script for medication, something, to be referred on to somebody else, to be told to take a walk in a park on a regular basis or go for a bushwalk, may not be what people want to hear.
Yeah, no, but it's certainly alive and well in Canada, and that's something that we're looking to implement here.
Yeah.
In the UK, for example, 3 out of every 5 GP appointments are associated with loneliness.
Wow.
I mean, Lifeline, which would be familiar to everyone, they receive 4,000 calls a day. Now, Lifeline is set up for really crises. So, people in a really quite desperate state that might be severe depression or have other mental health issues, maybe suicidal ideation. I met yesterday with the CEO of Lifeline in Australia, wonderful man called Colin Seary, and he said that 70% of their calls are not connected with crisis, which they get up to do. 70% of their calls are connected with loneliness.
Wow. That's incredible. That's something really needs to be done, doesn't it? And I feel there's a great opportunity for us on a personal level to reach out to those people around us and check in, like the huge impact that Are You OK has had, extending that to loneliness and actually having those tools and connecting more deeply with people around us.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a real opportunity. I mean, the unfortunate truth is that, whilst Are You OK have done a wonderful job in raising awareness and prompting people to say that, but the reality is that mental health issues have profoundly deteriorated in Australia in the last 5 years.
Is that a direct impact from COVID or?
Well, obviously COVID has not helped, but it's multifaceted in terms of the reason why people are lonely, but certainly the cost of living crisis, the fact that groceries in Australia have gone up by 20% in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Interest rates in the last 2 years have gone from, 2% to 8%. Now that has a profound impact on everyday Australians. And, that really impacts their ability to go out, engage in the community, do things with their family, because they're having difficulty paying for the roof over their head.
And then the stress
it's
levels.
multifaceted.
Yeah, and stress levels are higher as a result as well. And people aren't having that socialisation. They're not going out to restaurants. They're not going out to meet their friends, after work on a Friday because no one's in the office on Friday. And all those touch points that we're so used to having previously have gone.
And then you've got the cafe owners and the restaurant owners in the city that are really struggling to make a crust when people are only turning up in, the central business districts of our community 3, maybe 4 days a week.
Yeah, exactly. I remember years ago working in corporate and everybody went out on a Friday night. If not, 1 or 2 days after work, it was a lot more social. There are opportunities for those connections, and I see young people today and they're just not out as much. Like, they don't go out nearly as much as I feel. Maybe I have a skewed memory, but I feel that 10, 20 years ago, people went out a lot more. They're a lot more social. And now that our worlds have kind of closed in, that will have such a profound impact on loneliness. It's really quite sad. So, Martin, this has actually been such a fascinating conversation. Can you share 3 takeaways that people can start to implement to make a real difference?
Well, I think every human being in Australia can take small steps every day to strengthen your relationships. That may be within your family, it may be with your co-workers, it may be with your neighbours in the community. But there are little 1% of things that you could do to strengthen those relationships. There's also opportunities for individuals to support community activities to rebuild social connection. And that might be donating time, it might be coaching a soccer team, it might be visiting an aged care centre, it might be supporting a charity event at an RSL. It could be a whole variety of things. And I think just being alert to loneliness and having 2 ears and 1 mouth and thinking about what you can do positively within your community and within your immediate connections can have a profoundly important effect on loneliness and the mental well-being of Australians.
Yeah. Thank you. And Martin, where can people connect with you?
Well, they can just drop me a note if they'd like to connect with me on Martin, martin.blake at ihelm.com.au. They can also have a look at our website, which is thegroundswellfoundation.com.au. There's a section there on research and advocacy, and the Connections Matter report there. The interview with Tracy Crouch, the inaugural Minister from Loneliness, is there. There are papers there on what leaders can do or parents can do to positively tackle loneliness. So there are lots of assets on there that people can draw upon.
Fantastic. That is something that we should all read so we can actually take that ownership into our own hands and have the tools that we need to actually make a difference. Thank you, Martin. This is such a fascinating conversation, and you've raised so many points I think will be very interesting to so many people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, share and subscribe so you can stay updated with more from Midlife Unravelled. To see more Midlife Unravelled, follow us at midlifeunravelled.com or at Midlife Unravelled on Facebook and Instagram. We'll see you soon.